السلام عليكم يعطيكم العافية. Today we have a great talk for you by Mr. Burhan Khalid about the API economy and how can you motorize your data or monetize your data.
Motorize it or monetize it.
Please welcome Mr. Burhan Khalid.
Thank you, everyone. Please. Okay, today I'm going to give a talk about something a bit different. Usually our talks are highly technical, but today's talk is a bit of both. It's business-oriented as well, and towards the end, of course, to satisfy all the geeks here, there are a lot of technical topics as well. But today what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about the API economy. So we're going to define what is the API economy. I'll share some numbers and stats with you just to give you an idea of the kind of market we're talking about. We're going to talk about the three main drivers for the API economy. In other words, why should you, as a business, think about APIs as a core part of your offering. We'll share some API business models that are out there in the public so you can have an idea of how people are using APIs to make real money. Finally, we'll talk a little bit about enablement tools. What are the tools, the frameworks, the technologies you need if you're thinking about taking your data that's stored and creating an API on top of it and making it a successful operation. And finally, towards the end, we'll have some time for some questions and answers. But before we begin all that, just a few housekeeping items I would like to mention. First of all, there's a sign-up sheet. If you haven't signed your name, please make sure you sign your name and email. Thanks, as always, to Siddharth Lab for hosting us here. There are a few upcoming events at Siddharth Lab. There's the co-founder speed dating event. If you're a startup looking for a founder looking for some help, come by. It's on the 18th of March at 6:30 p.m. You can scan this QR code. It'll take you directly to the URL where you have to register. There are limited seats, so I encourage you to sign up. I don't know if the seats are already full or not. Of course, siddharth-lab.com for all your other events. Also, Google I/O Extended is back in Kuwait for 2015. It'll be May 28 and 29, again here at Siddharth Lab. For more information, you can just go to google.com/io to find out what Google I/O is all about. It's basically Google's love affair for the developers. Happens once every year. We host the extended event in Kuwait, so we live stream it in Kuwait, and we have technical discussions on the second day. It's a two-day event, May 28th and 29th. Okay. With that out of the way, let's get started with the first topic of the day, which is terms. So what is an API versus the API economy? So the API is an interface to a product or service, okay? That can be invoked or called over a communications network using standard protocols. This is the very basic definition of what an API is. However, the API economy, it's a new word, it's a new term. It's the economic impact that is affected when companies, governments, nonprofits, individuals, basically anyone that has data, starts to consume, mash up together, provide access to data that they own, and the real money effects that happen with that. So we're going to talk a little bit about both, but just to give you an idea of what kind of numbers we're talking about, here are some stats. So there are, as of today, more than 13,000 public APIs available for developers. That's in the number is 13,050 or something like that. However, approximately 20 times that is the number of private APIs that are out there that are being used. So there is a large catalog of APIs for developers to access. There are approximately 2.8 million apps that are available combined in both the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store as of today. Well, for Google Play, I can only find stats for December 2014. There are 4 billion people in the world that own cell phones. The world's population is 6.5 billion. So a large majority of people out there. Now I'm saying cell phones, not necessarily smartphones. So keep that in mind. Okay. However, there are 5 times the number of cell phones than there are personal computers in the world. In other words, mobile is big. And the reason I'm sharing these numbers is because one of the key drivers for API is mobile enablement. So it's a vast market out there. Which leads me very nicely to my next slide, which are the three drivers for the API economy. So we have mobile, which I talked about. We have HTML5, and B2B integration. These are the three core reasons why basically companies decide to expose their internal functions, processes, data across APIs. It's for one of these three enablers. Okay? So let's get right to it. What about mobile? Well, for mobile, the API enables data services. So you have backend development, support for your applications. It allows you very easily to have multi-platform capability. Today, you are developing on a mobile. Tomorrow, you might be developing on a TV. Next day, you might be developing on a wearable device. However, all those applications will need access to information. And depending on the device itself, you may not have the resources, or the system may not allow you the resources, even if they're available, to access all that data. So you have to rely on APIs. There's the factor of economy. So you develop an API once, and then you can consume it in multiple devices. So that's a thing, and it allows you a lot of reach. So if you have data that's exposed well in a well-designed API, it allows you to have extreme reach very quickly because developers will love to use it, especially on the mobile platform. So next we'll talk about B2B. Traditionally, integration in businesses has been done using SOA, which is a service-oriented architecture. Service-oriented architecture is one-to-one connection. It's between applications one-to-one. So if application A doesn't talk to application B, you put some middleware in there, and now they talk together. The problem is APIs are one-to-many. So when you have an API, you have one API and it talks to many, many, many clients. And the traditional middleware and service-oriented architecture applications that are available now in the market and that have been running in corporations for a long time are not really designed for one-to-many applications. They're designed for point-to-point connectivity between applications. Another driver for businesses, for APIs, is it replaces the traditional SOAP and XML RPC integrations that are difficult to maintain. And also, more importantly, it enables suppliers, partners, customers to integrate with businesses. So it's a real driver for them. I'll show you some examples of that. Finally, we get to HTML5. Of course, everyone here is familiar with single-page apps. You can't have a single-page app without an API. Okay? It reduces your time to market. It makes it easy for you to combine whatever application you have on your mobile onto the web, because in the end, you'll be using a common API. And of course, it's resource reuse. So if you have already developed an API once, it's very quickly and easily for you to move on to the mobile environment. So let me just give you an example of how this is affecting companies and how they identify themselves. Have a look at these. Amazon is software-driven retail. It used to be Amazon A to Z, everything under the sun. Lytro, you know Lytro? That little camera with the depth of field? It's software-defined cameras. And Philips calls their intelligent light bulbs software-controlled lighting. The idea is that APIs are where businesses are evolving and where businesses are seeing themselves. But what do APIs enable? Like, what do we get when we have strong APIs? We know why, which are the drivers, but what do we get when we have APIs? So there are many reasons why businesses use APIs. Here are just some of them. Of course, I mentioned briefly about the mobile backend. There's the customer ecosystem, the partner ecosystem, content distribution, which is very important, transaction distribution, which I'll talk about a lot. And then there are some businesses whose entire business model is an API. So their entire business is API as a business. And then, of course, internal use. So for the mobile backend, it's pretty simple. You support multiple operating systems with a single API. It can be auto-generated, for example, using Parse or Google Developer Tools. There's a security by obscurity. And what's the business driver behind it? It's very simple. It enables mobile. So if you have a mobile application, you need to have an API. It's just that basic. All right? What about customer ecosystems? For example, Dropbox, Salesforce. When when companies expose APIs and their driver is a customer ecosystem, what they're trying to get out of it is they're increasing the primary value from their product. So when Dropbox enables an API, it enriches the Dropbox service, which allows them to retain customers and upsell. Does that make sense? It's the point of the API is to have a customer ecosystem around the product or service, which enriches their product and maintains loyalty. Of course, that's not all. There's the partner ecosystem, which is a lot of companies add that. What happens is you have an existing product or service, but you don't want to develop every possible thing there is out there that could enrich it. So you enable your partners to develop and utilize on top of it. For example, Evernote does that. Evernote is now shifted completely to just an API platform. Even their own applications use their own APIs. And their partners have done many things. You can now buy a printer that scans directly to Evernote, for example. So what that gives businesses is it expands their reach and adds functionality. So the reasons business would want to do this is it's easier because partners will allow you to reach customers that you may not be targeting. So Dropbox, for example, or rather Evernote, may not be targeting small business offices because they don't know how to market them. But printer manufacturers know how to market them. So partners add that reach. But you need to have that ecosystem in place. You need to have that API enabled in place so that partners find it delightful to work with your platform. So they're more likely to enrich your application. So examples of these currently, Evernote, Twitter is a big one, Amazon Web Services is a big one. Next, we're going to talk about content distribution. This is mainly for content owners who want to syndicate their content, so we're talking about news agencies and things like that. Their channel partners are their API clients. So for them, it's not really a public API. It's an API for their channel partners to consume their data, their content, and then maybe repurpose it or redistribute it. So what they get from it as a core is it's a source of revenue for them because they can have subscription fees. They can have syndication fees. And having an API allows many people to sign up, which means it's easier to collect syndication fees. Of course, reach, and there's user convenience in it. Rather than going and scraping the content off the website, it's available to you in a standard format. So why not? This is an interesting one. It's something that I really like. It's a transaction distribution. Now, this is not transactions as money. This is transactions like allowing other companies to run or execute your core business process. So for example, let's take Expedia. Expedia's core business is selling travel. But they have an API that allows their partners to execute the travel reservation through Expedia. So it's their core transaction that they're outsourcing. Again, it's not transaction as in money, it's transaction as in the core business transaction. So the business drivers obviously drive transactions. The more Expedia sells travel, the more money they make. So why not enable other travel agents or even companies to execute those transactions through an API? It makes sense. Amazon is a big one. So Amazon allows you to sell on their platform. Okay. And finally, we have the newcomers, which is the entire business is an API. Or PayPal is an example of that. Stripe is an example of that. Twilio, SendGrid, most of the majority of companies their entire business revolves on their API, and their entire revenue model is sell the API transactions. So they sell each call on the API, and that's their product. Their product itself is the API. So for SendGrid, they don't have another product. Their entire product is we will provide you an API that allows your developers to easily, reliably send email. That's it. Nothing else. This is their entire business. Their entire business is an API. All that is very exciting. However, the most, I would say, innovative use, or where APIs really, really shine, is when companies use them internally. Because you cannot imagine the mountains of data that are stored in businesses that have been running. I'm talking about a traditional business like manufacturing or banking, for example, where I work. So we have mountains of data, and it's usually isolated, stored in silos, and it's very difficult to get a complete cross-data platform picture. But if we internally, I'm not talking about selling APIs or having a public interface, even if we as a bank internally have that API mindset, it makes our developers have single source of information, single source of truth, because there's only one API you ask. And it enables the business as a whole to become more agile. So they're quickly able to adapt to market conditions. It drives innovation, obviously, because you're now all of a sudden opened, and made it easier and made common functionality or data that was once proprietary or hidden. Those business drivers lead me to the next section presentation, which is what are some of the business models that startups or companies have adopted that revolve around APIs. But before I begin, I'd like to give a shout out to John Musser, who's an expert in this area. And if you want to know more about the API economy in general, I highly recommend you search on him. He has lots of slides on SlideShare, and he writes great articles on it. So thanks, John. So what are API business models? So the first thing I want to mention is, just because you have an API strategy, that does not mean it's your business model. A business model is something else, and an API strategy is something completely else. API strategy is tech, business models are going to make money. The key thing to remember is there is more than one way to make revenue from a single API. Usually more than one. It's very rare there's only one way to do it. There are four main categories for the API business model. Okay, there's free, there's the developer pays, or that the developer gets paid, and then there's the indirect model. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the most complicated one, which is free, which is Facebook. Facebook's API is completely free. They don't charge anything. API is available. This is their business model, right? But let's talk about some interesting ones. For example, here are some examples of APIs or companies where the developer pays. So when the developer pays, there are different payment models. So there's pay-as-you-go, which is like Amazon AWS. You get a certain quota for free, and then when you extend it, you pay as you go along. There's tiered. Tiered is what, for example, MailChimp uses. It's basically between 0 and 50 messages, it's free. From 50 to 100, you pay this much. From 100 to 500, you pay this much. But there's a freemium model, which is what Google Maps uses. So it's free, but for premium features, you have to pay. There's unit-based. Usually unit-based, you'll find, for example, if anyone has done any SMS work, you say you get 500 units, and each message costs you 2 units. So they charge you on the unit, not necessarily the money. And then there's the transaction fee, which is what, for example, PayPal uses. PayPal's business model is they charge you per transaction. There's a fee on the transaction. So this is when the developer pays. So I have to pay in order to use the API. All right, so this is a business model you can think of for your business if you want to expose APIs. But of course, the other side of the coin is you pay the developer. So this is when the developer gets paid. So for example, there's revenue sharing. Right? Google does that with AdSense. Google AdSense is revenue sharing. Does that make sense? Right? So Google shares revenue with you. And then, of course, there are affiliate programs. There are various kinds of affiliate programs. There's cost per action, and then there's cost per click. It's also called pay per click. There's a sign-up referral. So every time you sign up someone from your API, you get money. There's a recurring bonus. For example, RDO, I guess that's how you say it. They have their API business model is recurring. So as long as you keep API, you keep customers coming, you get paid more and more. Cost per action is, for example, Amazon Associates and eBay Commerce. So if Amazon Associates is like more cost per click, and eBay Commerce cost per action. Expedia is another one. So every time you do something, the developer gets paid rather than you having to pay to use their API. Okay? Here's a nice quote to get you started. 90% of what we do is business through APIs. This is what Expedia said. So 90% of their business is through APIs, executing through APIs. Okay? Of course,
it's a lot of many talk website usually, and then your research, you'll end up buying from Expedia.
Yeah. So there are some indirect revenue models. For example, Content acquisition is one. It's part of your business model. So for example, Twitter is a good one for this. Twitter needs tweets. That's how advertisers will come to Twitter, right? So their API strategy is enable people to post content, to post tweets easily. There is software as a service, which comes in two models. There is the included one, for example, FreshBooks.com. You go there, software as the API is available for you. And then there's the freemium model, where, for example, Salesforce.com, you sign up for the basic package, you don't get anything, but you upgrade, and then we'll include the API for you. So it's an upsell strategy. You know, if you want our API, sign up for the platinum package or for the gold package. There's content syndication, for example, New York Times. And then there's internal use. For example, the public website for Twitter uses their API, but it's internal for them. Netflix, all their devices use their API, but again, it's internal. It's public facing, but it's internal. And they have something like 800 devices that they support. This is customer facing. And then there's internal facing. So you have APIs that are not exposed to customers, but businesses use themselves to enable their services. Okay. Here's a quote to give you an idea. This is from eBay. Third-party applications built on the eBay open platform, accounting for 6.9 billion in gross merchandise volume in 2008. That's in 2008. Okay. Remember I said Twitter? 60% of all tweets come from third-party clients. So only 40% of tweets are actually people using Twitter products. 60% are coming from other clients. And that's good for Twitter because their entire business runs on content. If no one tweets, no one's going to bother advertising. Right? Here's another one. We find that if our customers use any single integration, they are 3 times as likely to convert to paid. So they're using the API as a conversion tool. So FreshBooks is free. If you know, everyone knows what FreshBooks is. It's like a accounting as a service. So you go there, you sign up, and they allow you to generate invoices and get paid. But it's free. I mean, you can sign up for free and use it. However, when customers use their API, and that's the value they get, they are 3 times more likely to convert to paid customers. If you want to take a picture with your mobile to preserve a slide, you better get ready because this is the slide you need to preserve. These are all the business models of the API defined. So there's free, there's the developer pays, which has pay-as-you-go, tiered, premium, unit-based, transaction fee-based. There's the developer gets paid, which is either you share your revenue or you have affiliate programs. There's the indirect, which is content acquisition, software as a service. You can either have an indirect software as a service or it's an upsell value. You have content syndication, and you have, for example, internal use APIs. Okay? I'll leave this up here for a second. If anyone has any questions. Oh, it's going to be on YouTube. Okay. All right. The final part of my slide is tools for enablement. So we talked about API, the economy, the size of it. We talked about how businesses have their business models evolving on our APIs. But then, how do you actually get off the ground? How do you start developing on it? So I'm going to talk a little bit about what are the tools that you use to unlock the API value for your business. So we're going to talk about the development toolkits, frameworks, things that programmers will use. Something for API aggregation, I'll explain what that is. How do you do access control monitoring? And something very important, documentation and community. If you don't have good community or documentation built around your API, no one's going to use it. And you need developers. Without developers, your API is dead. Right? Before I begin, some basic tips. REST is best, but it's not always required. So it is not mandatory that your API be RESTful. RESTful is not a specific, it's a guideline, right? Especially enterprise systems, they don't know REST, they don't care about it. And in enterprise, you're talking SOAP, you're talking XML RPC if you're very unlucky. Okay. You must decide on a common format for data and the layout of it. And it has to be the lowest common denominator format. So I'm talking JSON, which is popular. XML still, a lot of people use XML, or even CSV. CSV is used, you would be surprised how much valuable data is passed back and forth using CSV. This is because most transactional systems are still running COBOL, so CSV is... Yeah. Another key thing you have to keep in mind is you have to pay attention to internationalization. You have to standardize your dates and times. Pick on a standard and follow it rigorously. You will get tripped up between day, month, year, and month, day, year. Okay. Encodings, again, very important. If you don't know about encodings, come talk to me after the talk. I'll give you a link that every programmer, the minimum every programmer should need to know about encodings. And you should always think about your consumers rather than your data. Think about how the data can be most effective for those who want to use it or who would potentially want to use it. It could be that you need to repurpose. For example, if you have a highly normalized database, you might need to denormalize it to make the data relevant to your consumers. So you'll have to think about your consumers of your data. Okay? So with that in mind, if you have to write an API, you don't have an existing API, you have to write it. These are my recommendations, so take them with a grain of salt and feel free to not follow them. I would suggest you avoid the API in a box models like Django REST framework or an ESB suite, which has you turn on a switch and everything turns on. The reason being, for optimal use, your API should stick to the lowest level possible. Okay? The API's job should be simply to serialize, package, and orchestrate data. That's it. Okay? Things you should be using, definitely you should be using a message pipeline for non-blocking operations. You should definitely be using a serialization framework. Usually it comes built in with your programming language. So most programming languages have some XML library, they have some JSON library. Make sure translation, orchestration, rebuilding your data for the audience is there. But your API at the most basic level, its job purpose is to serialize objects. Its purpose is not to handle, for example, authentication and metering and throttling and all that stuff. Think about it for a second. The core purpose of an API is simply to expose data in a reliable and consistent manner. Which is why I personally caution against, there's nothing wrong with Django REST framework. I've used it myself. But it's when you're trying to concentrate on API and data, it kind of gets in your way because it's trying to do so many things at once. Same thing with ESB suites. If you're not into anything to do with enterprise, you will not know what an ESB suite is. But it's something very expensive. Okay? So once you have that in mind, these are some tools that I would recommend you look into, simply to write APIs. Now, there are many terms for this. I call them the API service bus, but you will see them used as ESB, like Mule ESB, for example. You'll see the word middleware, but I like to call them API service bus. And there's Mule ESB, there's a Fuse, which has been bought by JBoss, and then there's WSO, and there are many others, but I just picked a few. Yes. Would I recommend one for Django? Django is a front-end framework, so you can use any one of these with Django. WSO is written entirely in Python. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. You can.
Your logic is usually there.
When you're designing APIs, the API's job is to take the data and serialize it. Your business logic sits somewhere else. Okay. So you have a core layer that transforms the data, and then you have the entities that you want to expose. I'm talking about REST here. Or you may just have an XML API on top of it. So you can use Django and expose the data, but in the end, Django is just going to spit out what? JSON or XML. So we, for example, I use Mule at the office, and I use WSO2 at the office as well. We have applications that use JBoss as well.
So Django is spin up like JSON, let's say. What's the role of Mule?
It's an orchestration bus. It basically can listen on a port, and then execute transactions based on the information given it. It can also create an API for you. So suppose you have an Oracle database and you don't have anything else, and you want to expose this Oracle database as an API. It has a connector for Oracle, and then it can create a web server for you where it listens on REST, and then it does the orchestration for you. Got it? Or you can choose not to use a tool and write it all yourself. So, I mean, there's that option as well. I've done all of these. Various degrees of difficulty. One thing is, you need to make sure that you understand is most of the API world sits either between Java, majority of it, okay? There's a few .NET, but the majority of the ESB applications are written in Java. For example, WSO2 is an odd duck. It's written in Python. It's 100% pure Python ESB. Mule supports Python and Perl and any other script, but it's a Java application. Okay? JBoss, of course, it's pure Java, and you can also the same integration that allows Mule to run Python, you can use it in JBoss. So it's just a pipeline, right? So these are the tools you would use, or you may choose not to. And then there's something called API aggregation. Because there are 13,000 some odd APIs available for the public to use as of today, developers can get burdened down with having to write connections with every single service and learning each API's call structure. So there are services now coming out that are API aggregators. What they do is they collect APIs that relate to a specific function, and then they give you a proxy API that you would use to execute multiple functions at once. It's a fairly new area. There are a lot of acquisitions going on. Let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. Here are some API aggregators. So for example, if you want to do automation, you can talk to any one of these guys, and they will provide you an API which then talks to every other API out there. So they take care of all the individual APIs, and you have a single proxy API that you can use. Okay. There's content delivery. There's for funnel aggregation. There's for BI and analytics. For example, these guys, what they do is they will collect all your public data sources, provide you a single API from which you can create a dashboard. And you don't have to know the individual APIs that are going on behind. For example, recommendation engines is a good one. You don't want to have to write an individual recommendation engine API for multiple sources. So they have a single API source for you to use, and then you build on top of that. For example, personal data. These services, they collect public and private data for you from various APIs, and then they provide you a unified API for your data. These are good to know when you're when you're getting more than 4 or 5 APIs in your application. Time to look into one of these guys. Okay. We talk about access control. Yeah. Yeah, there is. For social services, it's Postana. Social media is something else. Social services is something else. I recommend you just go have a look. Okay. This is very important. Once you have an API running, how do you manage access? Usernames, passwords, keys, thresholds, throttling, OAuth, all that fancy stuff. How do you monitor API use for usage and for abuses, and also for billing purposes? And how do you do overall API management? You may have a catalog of APIs that you want to consolidate and expose. So these are some tools that you can use. Apogee, I've given a talk on them. They're very good. Mashery is now owned by Intel. It's extremely good. It's used by a lot of the brand names that you would know and some that you would not even think about. Coca-Cola is a client of Mashery, for example. Like, what do Coca-Cola have as a public API? But they use it internally within their organization. Right. 3Scale, which is this logo here, they're also one of those independent operators. They have really good information about API aggregation. If you want to just learn more about APIs, what they are, what the API economy is all about, they have good content there. Epiphany, which is this guys here, they also provide a similar kind of service. Strike Iron, which is Informatica. Layer 7, which was acquired by CA. And Akana, which is one of those independent players. All these companies will provide you the same thing. They'll provide you a management interface where they talk to your APIs, and then they control the public access. So you will assign developer passwords here. You'll manage OAuth keys here. You will have your throttling, access control, monitoring, everything done on this layer, and you concentrate on your APIs only. And they'll take. That's why I said when you develop APIs, don't bake all that in, because these guys do it a lot better. One that I would like to mention, API Axle. If you just want to try it out, it's completely free. It's completely open source. You can download it now and run it, and it will automatically expose APIs and give you a nice dashboard and tell you who's accessing what, and creates a proxy for you and everything. It's 100% open source. All right. Finally, last but definitely not least, it is extremely important to deal with to take care of your developers that will be using your APIs. Without developers, your API is essentially useless. I'm not talking about public developers. I'm even talking about developers within your organization. So you need to develop you need to have a developer community. So some of the features of a good developer community, of course, easy to understand API documentation. I mean, this is the basic requirement. Search should be there. I'm not talking about a search API, but searching on your APIs. A connection pooling and management. So how do developers connect to your systems? And you should develop a community around it. So you should have some community managers. You should have some developer evangelists, people who are going out there and speaking about your APIs. A lot of big companies have multiple people doing this role. Okay. However, there are tools to help you out. Out of the box, both Mashery and Apigee will provide you a developer community. If you go to many companies' developer portals, you will find out they're actually running off of these guys, either Mashery or Apigee. These are two major players. Mashery, especially, I know New York Times is hosted completely on Mashery. They have a lot of brand name clients there. You can build your own. For example, DRF, it's okay here. You can mix and match various components because in the end, it's just another application on top. Or you can use dedicated products. For example, Akana, which used to be called SOS Software, has a separate product called Community Manager. It's designed just as a separate application, just to manage the developers of your APIs. It doesn't do anything with the APIs. It just manages the community. Mule has an excellent product called API Portal, which does exactly the same thing. It's a separate product in and of itself. You stick it on a server, you give it access to your internal APIs, then it manages credentials, developers, community. It even creates documentation. Sample clients, for example, are all available here. Okay. Having said all that, and it's a long presentation. This is slide number 39, and I've been talking for 20 minutes. Actually, 45 minutes. Let's have some conclusions. So, first of all, the API economy. So the APIs are the next great frontier for software enablement. Okay, they are a must if you want to expand your product or service, or if you want to develop a service that's enriching. I mean, you can't run away from them. There's no way to hide. You use Android app, you're using an API. You develop an iOS app, you're using an API. Interoperability, Internet of Things, smart devices, smart watches, Arduino, all that stuff will require APIs to bring to value. There is no other way. There is no value in a smartwatch that can't talk to your phone. There's nothing smart about it. I might as well have this watch, which doesn't do anything, which barely tells the time, right? And as hopefully as I've demonstrated, APIs have been proven to provide tangible bottom line business benefits. You saw those quotes that 60% of Twitter's content comes from third-party clients for Twitter, and that's their main business, is content. So it's something real, it's something tangible. Now, that's the API economy. The API business, you will get maximum impact when the API is an integrated part of your business and not just some garnish you add on top once everything is running. And you may find that the biggest impact is by using APIs internally and making you more agile when you respond to the market. Okay, and choose the business model for APIs that best reflects your business. So there are multiple ways you can make money. You can have it completely free, as in the case of Facebook. You can have developers pay. You can pay developers for referrals, and so on. We also talked a little bit about the development process. So there's a large buffet of tools available. They range all the way from all-in-one services to low-level frameworks. the thing to keep in mind is you should pick the tool that best meets the needs of your consumer and the quality of your data. So if your data is unstructured, for example, and it's spread everywhere, it's not standardized, these all-in-one services will not give you as much impact as if you have proper standard structured data. I'm not saying it needs to be perfect, but it needs to be in a uniform format, for example. As I mentioned, pick a standard format. It's very, very important for dates, for serialization, for encoding, especially if you're dealing with non-ASCII characters. Don't forget to monitor and control access, but don't build it as part of your API. Let your API do what APIs do best, which is expose data reliably, accurately, uniformly. And you can find, I would say, better solutions that will save you time, money, and effort when it comes to access management and control. And finally, don't forget about your community. Provide for and develop a developer portal to advertise your APIs. Provide API clients, sample clients, documentation. Change logs is very important. Nominate, hire, or promote from within your community managers and developer evangelists. And keep your community social and updated. And thank you very much for your time. I'll make the slides available after the presentation. That's my Twitter handle, and I'll take any questions from there.
Questions?
I have a question. It's not related to the presentation, but it's for you, though.
Yeah.
Are you the same Burhan on 2:48 a.m.?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to know.
Yes.
Other than this very relevant question.
Yeah, exactly. Other than this, yes. Yeah.
I usually get videos with the API. It's like, it's a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So what you should do is you should have a proxy sitting in front of your API calls. So your API calls are not directly exposed to the API client. API clients talk to, just like as if you're doing load balancing on a traditional application. And this client or this proxy handles authentication for it. So instead of expiring passwords in your database, which also has other data, you expire and set credentials on this proxy. So the proxy authenticates the clients, and then it passes an internal token to your API, gets the results back, and passes forward. That's why you can do monitoring, you can do charging, you can do, all the richness that you expect happens when you have this proxy in the middle. If the same piece of code is dealing with authentication and serialization and data exposure and database access.
Sometimes you have a session manager.
Yeah.
Do you think that this proxy can manage user ID?
Yes, that's what they do. That's what the proxies do. So the proxy will handle, for example, you want to create an account, go sign in using Google or create an account here. Here is your OAuth token. Here is when it expires. All this is taken care of the proxy. And the proxy authenticates the user, the developer. The developer is actually the developer's API, not the developer itself, but the application the developer is using. And then it passes that reliability token back to your API. So the API, all it's doing is optimize for sending data back. Okay? And then the proxy ensures that the data is coming from an authenticated source. That way you can, at one time, expire credentials, at one time expand this layer if you have a lot of users, and then expand this layer independently. If you're baking it all in, you have that same problem where the web and the application is sitting on the same server with scaling. So it helps.
Other issues like caching.
This is taken care of.
What is it? Which part?
By the proxy part. Yeah.
The front.
The front end. Just like you would in a traditional application. Yes. Sama. Any other questions? No? Okay, great. Thank you very much. And
If I use that PC, it's already connected.
yeah, sure. No problem.